Mr. Keith.
My lady, the next witness is Susanna Story, the Permanent Secretary at the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. Could you
Hope you were warned we wouldn't get to you this afternoon.
I was, thank you.
Could you be sworn, please?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
Declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat.
Could you please commence your evidence by giving us your full name?
Susanna Jemima Story.
Thank you very much, Ms. Story. Thank you for attending today and for the provision of your witness statement dated the 2nd of August 2024, some 29 pages, and for the 44 exhibits that you also supplied. You are now the Permanent Secretary at the DCMS, but from August 2019 to February 23, were you the Director General of what is known as the Digital and Media Group in the DCMS?
I was.
And within the many directorates for which you were no doubt responsible, was there a directorate called the Security and Online Harms Directorate?
Yes.
And within that directorate, was there something known as the Counter Disinformation Unit?
There was originally Counter Disinformation Cell.
What are, as far as the government sees it, disinformation and misinformation?
Yeah, I put the government's definition in my statement. Disinformation is defined as the deliberate creation and dissemination of false information, which is intended to deceive and mislead. And misinformation is the same, but without the deliberate intent.
In terms of the government understandably seeking to monitor falsities or what is being said in the public domain that is untrue and trying to do something about it, does it matter whether the false information is being deliberately disseminated and is therefore disinformation as opposed to misinformation?
I mean, I think it can be context-specific, but in the case of this piece of work and this team at the time of COVID, we were interested in either, because what we were trying to do was look at mis or disinformation that might be causing harm and might cause harm to public safety or public health or national security.
So the intent behind the dissemination matters perhaps a little less.
It might do.
And you've just referred to it, but if you could just build on your answer, please. Why, in the context of the extreme public health demands of a pandemic, is mis and disinformation a matter for government?
Well, as I said in my statement, there had been a sort of growing focus in policy terms on mis and disinformation for a number of years before the pandemic. And we'd first been asked to set up a formal team on this actually in 2019. And the reasons I think the government was focused on it is situational awareness. It helps you understand a situation if you know what is going on online in open fora. And in particular, in some circumstances, you are worried about mis or disinformation because they could contribute to real world problems. And as I said in my statement, if it's helpful for me to briefly elaborate, actually at the start of the pandemic, there was vandalism and fires on telephone aerials and infrastructure, and that was causing us real concern at the time. So I think there's lots of different examples why governments might be interested in this at all sorts of different times, but particularly in the context of a global pandemic.
Just to try to delineate the particular types of harm or harmful consequences from not countering in a proportionate and reasonable way dis and misinformation. Firstly, presumably, if obvious falsehoods are not countered and not dealt with, there can be a heightened distrust in government and health services generally. Would you agree?
I would.
There could also be a heightened distrust in medicine in particular vaccines.
Potentially.
Thirdly, it can have an impact, can it not, on rates of uptake of vaccines?
Potentially.
And I suppose, is there a link also to routine immunisation? So falsity perpetrated in the public domain or propagated in the public domain about vaccines in the context of COVID can have an indirect effect on routine immunisation take-up.
Yeah, and I think before I was even in post, I know that the health department had talked to the DCMS team about vaccine hesitancy. So it had been, which could be caused by lots of different things.
Sure.
But that had been a concern. But just the one thing I want to point out at this point, if it's okay, is that whilst mis or disinformation could contribute to a lot of those things you've just described and many more real-world harms, there was always a very, very acute focus in this team on freedom of expression. So it wasn't that just because something caused a harm, that was a problem. There was a balance between the assessment of that harm and, of course, the need for freedom of expression.
We'll come back to that. I was only asking you in very general terms what conceptually the harms are and why government is interested in this issue. In very general terms, again, Ms. Story, if the government corporately comes across a piece of mis and disinformation, or rather, if there is a piece of mis or disinformation in the public domain, is there a distinct limit, in fact, on what the government can do about it beyond monitoring, simply acknowledging that it's there, looking at it, reaching a view as to the potential harm, and then bringing it to the attention of, in particular, social media companies and saying, well, it's a matter for you?
Yes, broadly, I agree with that. So the sort of the remit of this team was very clearly defined and didn't include everything. So there were specific parameters set out. It was only looking at open source online information. If in the particular searches it was doing, all of which would have been agreed with ministers in terms of those parameters, if in the course of that certain mis or disinformation was captured, then if the team believed that mis or disinformation was false and also potentially breached the terms and conditions of the social media platforms, then they would flag it to them. But then, to your point, it was a matter for the platforms what they did about it. They might decide to do nothing. So this team was analysing those narratives and trends and taking action in relation to some of them, but the team itself had no power to require the platforms to do something about it.
We'll look at that in a minute or two in more detail. So just to deal again at quite a high level with the counter-disinformation units or cells' role in the general scheme of things. It was not a body that was concerned with putting out into the public domain the government's general public health messages.
Absolutely not.
It wasn't to do, in fact, it had nothing to do with the provision of public health information about from the DHSC or the NHS.
No.
It had nothing to do with the Cabinet Office or the DCMS's usual communication systems by which they deal with the public and deal with the press and deal with public health messages.
No, that's right. The cell was inputting some information into some of those teams, but it itself was not an output in those communication terms that you describe.
It was monitoring what was going on in the public domain, and we'll look at in a moment in detail at what's meant by public domain.
Yeah.
Telling ministers what's out there and taking a view on reporting individual instances of mis and disinformation to the social platforms for them to deal with.
Reporting narratives and trends, not always individual instances.
All right, reporting trends as well. And did the unit have any function in or any role in relation to or do anything remotely connected with surveying people? Carrying out surveillance of people?
No, and in fact, you can see in the compliance policy that I've included as one of the exhibits, it was very explicit that it should not be doing that.
Well, look at
there
that.
was monitoring within certain parameters, but not surveillance under the law.
Did it, in in law have the ability, or in practice, did it take to itself the ability to look at private material?
So it was looking for narratives and trends in open source public material, so things that people or entities had posted, not private communications. There was from time to time in the search for information against specific parameters, sometimes as a kind of byproduct, some personal information might be captured. So, for example, a Twitter handle or some other way of identifying the post. But the team then took careful steps to anonymize that data before onward transmission within the government system. And obviously, if they were flagging this information because it had met the parameters to be flagged to the social media companies, they would also be making clear, just for identification purposes only. So the team were very mindful of their obligations under the Data Protection Act.
So to summarise that, the unit only looked at material in the public domain, so a social media post, for example.
Yeah.
When somebody posts a post on social media, there is an element of that post which is personal, namely the username, the person who put it there.
Yes, it could be an anonymized name or some other name, but it could
it's a
also
piece
be,
of data.
It could, yes, that's right. It could be their personal data.
But that piece of personal data, such as it is, but it's probably anonymized, is put into the public domain alongside the post by the person who posts it.
That's right.
So when the unit says, well, there is a bit of data here that's personal, they are only monitoring or responding to data which has already been put into the public domain by the user.
That's right. And
Right.
As I said, the primary objective of the unit is actually the narrative or trend in the information, not the personal data. So, for example, if the post said something about COVID being connected to 5G, that's the issue the unit is looking for.
So you don't really care who posts it. What you're concerned about is the impact on the general message of the contents of the post.
That's right, the
Right.
narrative and the trend.
And does the, if you don't care about who's posting it, does it follow from that the unit had no interest in and no business in following individuals, whether they be members of the public, journalists, academics, parliamentarians? Well, I'll come back to the question of journalists and parliamentarians specifically in a moment, but did you care who was posting?
The primary objective was those narrative and trends. It was the substance of the post. It was not the private individual's information. And as I'm sure you're going to say in a minute, there were some specific carve-outs to ensure parliamentarians and journalists were not captured.
Could we just look at the sorts of disinformation that the CDU had to deal with and have up 000361167? So this is a note to ministers dated the 22nd July 2020. It's a submission, and it comes from the Security and Online Harms Directorate. We can see that in the top right-hand corner, can't we?
Yeah.
And this isn't actually it's not actually one of the weekly reports. It's a general submission, isn't it, on the work that the unit's doing.
That's right.
If you could turn over, please, to pages 6 to 8. Since late April 2020, a range of anti-vaccination narratives have been observed by the Counter-Disinformation Cell. That's the CDU, isn't it?
It is.
Vaccines as a form of population control. The UK government will introduce mandatory vaccines. The vaccine is a means used by government or the elites to modify, control the population. Microchips will be injected. Vaccines are being deliberately trialled on those from BAME backgrounds or frontline workers. There's a reference there to the number of deaths, I suppose, of the participants. So one narrative is that there were disproportionate or highly significant levels of death. Bill Gates gets a note up there. Vaccines aren't necessary. COVID's harmless. Vaccines are harming health. In relation to the harming health element in vaccines, did the unit proceed on the obvious and self-evident basis that all medicines, including vaccines, may have side effects, some of them quite serious or very serious? What was the concern, however, held here was that there was a general narrative that the vaccine had had significant side effects on those involved in the trials.
Yeah, so this is a summary in the advice to ministers, which was for their information, and this was in the summer of 2020, and I think it's giving an illustration of the sorts of themes and narratives that were out there.
So this wouldn't necessarily trigger any sort of reaction on the part of the CDU. This is just identification of the narratives that were in the public domain.
That's right. So, yeah.
If we then look at 000361175, we can see an example of a particular report. Was this a weekly report?
Yes.
Over the past week, the cell has observed 57 pieces of content and made 16 escalations to platforms. Is that a reference to telling the platforms that these pieces have brought themselves to your attention and you inviting the platforms to apply their policies as they see fit and do whatever they want to do?
Yeah, so the unit had this status called trusted flagger status, which the government and some NGOs and academics and other bodies had. And it meant that if, in this instance, the unit was seeing mis or disinformation that it believed was harmful to public health or public safety, and it believed was in breach of that particular or multiple platforms' terms of service, then it would flag them to them. So what this is saying is there have been 57 pieces of content that meet those criteria, but only 16 have met the criteria to be escalated to platforms. And then, as we were discussing before, it may well be, and this document I think goes on to show what happened, not all of the 16 would have had necessarily the same treatment by the platform because it was their prerogative to decide what to do.
Right. And we can see that there were a number of instances in which the cell had brought to its attention or saw online in public documents, posts or videos dealing with the extent of the impact of the vaccines and their supposed high levels of side effects, health misinformation about the genetic alteration of cells, that the vaccines are biologically manipulated bioweapon. If you could scroll back out over the page, hoax material, no pandemic, COVID-19 is a bioweapon. And in some of these instances, not necessarily all of them, the social media platforms responded by taking them down or not taking them down as they saw fit.
Yeah, each social media platform would have their own policies and it would be their prerogative to decide what to do.
Right. Very briefly, and just by way of overview, were the officials in the unit subject to a significant degree of oversight and legal obligation?
Yes. So I was responsible for those teams. There'd be all sorts of the usual parameters in place, and they would be aware of their obligation. And ultimately, we all reported to the ministers, and at the time it was Oliver Dowden.
Ministerial oversight, subject to the GTPA, that's the General Data Protection Regulation and the Data Protection Act, Human Rights Act, Civil Service Code, obligations of integrity, and so on, and political neutrality.
Yeah.
And, of course, subject to the common law obligation to ensure that all data monitoring and analysis was lawful, necessary, and proportionate. Was there also an express ban on the reference or the referral of content posted by parliamentarians and journalists?
Yes, there was.
How did that work?
Well, if the content that met the criteria that I've described in terms of being mis or disinformation and potentially risking public health and public safety and potentially breaching the terms and conditions of the platforms, that was the way in which it was searched for. But any information posted by journalists or elected members of Parliament would not be included. So that was a specific carve-out to ensure free and open debate and freedom of expression.
You mentioned earlier the compliance policy. Let's perhaps have a look at that. INQ 000361185. If we go to the top, thank you very much, now of page 4. we can see there the reference to human rights laws, data protection legislation, surveillance laws, RIPA, and of course there's an extremely tight, rigorous process within RIPA providing for warrants for active intervention such as surveillance and so on. And none of that had any application at all to the unit. Page 6, paragraph 3.8, we can see something of the general obligations set out. The analysis and conduct must meet the permitted purpose, must be necessary and proportionate, doesn't amount to surveillance, and there's a checklist. Page 7, paragraph 4.1, is this right? There is detail there set out of the flagging process. That's the process you've just described, whereby if something appears to fall within the remit of the unit, it's public, it could lead to significant harm, then the officials have to put the material through a kind of escalating process of deciding whether or not it gets referred to the social media platform.
That's right.
Page 9, do's and don'ts. Lots of hedging around the functions and the role of the unit, and in borderline cases, did in fact officials have to seek sign-off from more senior officials before matters could be referred to the social media platform?
They did.
All right. By comparison to the number of documents, posts, videos, whatever, referred to social media platforms by the CDU during the course of the pandemic, how many documents, are you aware, posts or videos, did the social media platforms themselves remove without any kind of prodding from the CDU?
So I don't have
Roughly.
Yeah, I don't have a scientific assessment. In my statement, I've included, the thousands and sometimes millions of documents that the social media platforms themselves dealt with. And I think I say that we looked at something like 3,500 pieces of information flagged, of which around 55% related to vaccine issues. So it was a tiny, tiny proportion. But as I say, this was really about an input into a wider process. But the platforms themselves, I think over the course of the pandemic, also evolved their own processes, and you would want to talk to them about those specifics.
Of course. I think in your statement you say that you've obviously done some research on this. Meta displayed warnings on Facebook on more than 190 million pages as being, at least in part, false, partly false, altered or missing context. In September 21, Meta reported it removed more than 20 million pieces of false COVID-19 or vaccine-related content. Yeah. But I'm very sorry to observe that rather puts the unit in your department's work into the shade.
Absolutely, and I think that is important to be clear about, which is the scale of the responsibility of the platforms in these situations. And also, as I said there, it wasn't just that they would remove information. A really important thing during COVID was to be the signpost and the flag to trusted health information. And that was something that the team worked closely with them on.
Just for a moment on that. So I didn't ask you deliberately at the beginning, but one of the major ways in which a government may respond to dis or misinformation is to keep on repeating its own message.
Yeah.
And obviously it was important that social media platforms, along with all other organizations which disseminate material into the public domain, that they were encouraged to keep on printing, repeating, disseminating the public health lines.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. X, you say, had removed over 65,000 pieces of content and suspended over 3,000 accounts for violations of its COVID-19 guidance. YouTube removed over 130,000 videos, and TikTok introduced a COVID-19 information hub, providing answers to questions, no doubt with the help of the government, on public health issues, which is viewed 921 million times. So that gives you an idea of the scale.
Yeah.
Was the work of the disinformation unit, quote, secret extrajudicial censorship with no oversight, akin to how illegal terror content is dealt with by the government.
That is not my view.
Do you believe that the genuine experiences of the vaccine injured and bereaved were wrongly swept up in this monitoring process and wrongly brought to the attention of social media platforms?
No, I mean, as I say, the purpose of the unit was very specifically trying to minimise the public health or public safety impact of this mis or disinformation. Obviously, you're doing general searches, so it is possible that some information could be captured and ultimately flagged if it hit those criteria I said, that might not be mis or disinformation. And then it's for the platforms to assess whether it meets their terms of service or not, and then for them to decide what to do.
Did the flagging system that you described and the trusted status which the CDU have in any way lead to pressure being applied to social media companies to remove content wrongly?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, the Secretary of State and I think the Health Secretary were very keen to work with the platforms, and there was a number of round tables. Later in the pandemic, after the vaccine, we had this counter-disinformation policy forum. So there was lots of proactive work with them, but that was more about this point of getting them to flag trusted health information, getting them to make sure their terms and conditions of service were clear and transparent about what they were actually doing in terms of content moderation.
And finally, just so we can put the work of the unit into a wider context, it would be very helpful if you could just describe what you see as the main impacts of the Online Safety Act in the sphere of public health disinformation. The inquiry is aware that the Act obliges companies to take action over illegal or harmful content online, and there is, in fact, I think, a new offence created called a false communications offence, concerned with spreading information that is known to be false. But do the provisions in the Act cover the same territory as public health disinformation and misinformation?
You're asking me to go outside the remit of my current role, but I'm happy to give you a personal view. So during the course of the years before and during the pandemic, we were working on the Online Safety Bill, which became the Act. And as you rightly point out, I understand it does contain some measures in relation to false communication and foreign interference. As to its effectiveness, I think we need to wait to see when the Act is fully in force and then see what happens.
It wasn't a trick question. It seems to be apparent from the very features of the Act that you described that it wasn't directed at public health disinformation and misinformation.
No.
It deals with illegal and harmful content, which
That's right.
may or may not be the same thing.
That's right. It could overlap, but that isn't the primary purpose of it. And it did, in effect, become the regulatory regime for mis and disinformation. But at the time of the pandemic, we didn't have such a regulatory regime.
No. But when was the bill first conceived?
Well, when I came into the job in August 2019, we'd already had the Internet Safety Green Paper and the government response, and then we were preparing the white paper was out, and then we were preparing the response to the white paper, and then the bill was introduced during the pandemic.
So the Act, the bill followed the 2017 Green Paper, Internet Safety Strategy.
That's right, and then its own white paper.
Thank you very much, Ms. Story. Those are all the questions I have for you, but there may be some further questions.
There are. Thank you very much, Mr. Keith. Ms. Morris, who's sitting at the back there, if you could make sure your answers get into the microphone,
yes.
I'd be really grateful.
Sure.
Thank you very much, my lady. Ms. Story, I asked questions on behalf of the COVID Adverse Reaction and Bereaved groups, and these groups represent those who've suffered injury or bereavement following their voluntary acceptance of the COVID vaccine, just so you understand where the questions are coming from.
Thank you.
I'm going to focus my two questions on the issue of how the information that members of those groups shared on social media may have been wrongly labelled by the CDU as misinformation or disinformation, okay? And by way of context, of course, we're dealing here with a population-level rollout of a novel set of vaccines where, even though there have been clinical trials, there's an acceptance that there would be adverse reactions and that might not have been identified by those trials. And therefore, the signals for any emerging adverse reactions would need to be carefully identified and monitored. You've said in your statement that if the CDU came across a new narrative and needed to determine the veracity of the content, it would use third-party sources to establish whether the content could constitute mis- or disinformation. And you say that that involved looking at trusted, publicly available sources, including the NHS guidance for COVID, credible journalistic sites such as the BBC, or using independent fact-checking sources, such as, I think you gave the example of Full Fact.
That's right.
Okay, thank you. So given the context that I've set out of the stage of the vaccine rollout, would you accept that, given the speed and the novelty of the vaccine rollout, there could be instances where individuals reported injuries on social media that they attributed to the vaccine, but due to the early stage of the rollout, third-party sources like the NHS, public health sources and the media might not have yet had sufficient time to evidence those and verify those claims?
I can agree with the point you're making that it may well be the public health authorities hadn't had time to verify what was being said. What I don't know, I'm afraid, is what then happened to that information, whether it was picked up by the CDU and or whether it was flagged to social media, or whether social media companies, under their own terms and conditions, might have taken action in relation to this content.
Okay. But it may well have been flagged by you if someone's reporting an injury that you can't find any third-party verification for.
I think it's conceivably possible, but my understanding of what the unit was doing was more about really significant trends and narratives of misinformation. So the example I was giving in my statement was when the 5G masts were being vandalised. So it's hard for me to give you a definitive answer, I'm afraid.
Understood. But in the document that Mr. Keith showed you in your evidence earlier on, the list of what you described as being an anti-vaccination narrative, vaccination being harmful to health was part of that narrative. Would you agree?
That was, yes, in the summary document that was giving ministers illustrations of some of the trends that were online.
Okay. So just my second question, following on from that, would you accept that if it did happen, the labelling of unverified claims as mis- or disinformation prematurely could discourage a discourse of legitimate concerns and thereby potentially delaying the identification of new signals around safety of the vaccines?
I mean, I think it was unlikely, given the scale we discussed of the amount of information this unit was flagging and then what happened to it, that would be the case, just because of it's much more likely, I think, that under social media companies' ordinary terms and conditions, theoretically, they could be making a decision in a general sense without understanding the specifics.
Could you make sure you're... Sorry.
Sorry.
Don't worry, Ms Morris will understand if you don't look at her.
Sorry if I'm not looking at you.
That's okay. You mentioned scale, just finally, you mentioned scale, but can you help with whether the social media companies adopted a similar definition of mis- and disinformation? Would there have been consistency outside in those organisations?
I think you'd have to ask them that. I don't have that detail of information at the moment.
That's helpful. Thank you. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Ms Morris. Ms Mitchell, who's opposite you.
I appear as instructed by Amber Anwar on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. It's been said in this inquiry many times that COVID does not respect borders, and the same, I think, could be said of social media. In that regard, do you think that an approach which was cross-border in relation to how you deal with misinformation and disinformation, the social media policy, would be good for all four nations in a future pandemic?
Mis and disinformation is a devolved policy area, as I think you're alluding to. But yes, obviously, that it is the case that everything to do with tech policy, in my experience, goes cross-border, and it isn't that a post can't be read by somebody across the border. So I appreciate what you're saying, but it's really not my decision as to how that kind of issue would be addressed in a future pandemic.
No, indeed. But what I'm asking you is whether or not you think that that would be a helpful way to deal with it, not whether or not you would implement it.
Well, I said in my statement that because it was a devolved policy area, we were primarily not focused on those areas, but there were ad hoc connections between ministers and their devolved counterparts, and also some of the work of this unit was inputting into wider DHSC boards, which did include the devolved administration. So there was some connection in some of these areas, and obviously if we thought it was helpful, we would have absolutely done that.
But do you think it would be helpful?
It's very hard to say, not knowing what the specifics are of the situation, potentially. But obviously we'd have to work out how that would work in a devolved policy area.
I'm obliged, my lady.
Thank you very much, Ms Mitchell. I think that completes the questions for you, Ms Story. I'm extremely grateful to you for your help. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Would my lady wish to hear from the next witness, Charlotte Crichton, with or without a break?
I think just carry straight on, unless the witness wanted it.
No, I think we can do that. Thank you. So the next witness is Charlotte Crichton of UKCV Family.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Ms Crichton, I know you were lined up to give evidence last week, but sadly you couldn't because of the death of your mother. I'm really sorry.
Thank
And,
you.
and it's really kind of you to come and assist us when you must be still right in the middle of your grieving process. So thank you very much indeed.
Ms Crichton, could you commence, please, your evidence by giving us your full name?
My name is Charlotte Elizabeth Crichton.
Thank you very much. Thank you for attending today, as the Chair said, and for providing the inquiry with the material that you have. You're the founder of a group known as UKCV Family. We'll talk a little bit more in a moment about what they do. But as the founder, excuse me, you've produced two statements. One dated the 17th of October 24, and I'm going to mention this, running to a whopping 344 pages. And a second supplementary witness statement, a further 176 paragraphs of text with another 117 exhibits to go with the 500 or so more exhibits that you produced with your first witness statement. I want to assure you, the Chair, the inquiry legal team, and myself have read all that material on a repeated basis. So we've gone back through your statements again and again. UKCV Family is a group which is concerned with injury and bereavement following vaccination. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, obviously, the phrase following vaccination says nothing other than making a temporal reference, it followed in time after vaccination, about the cause of the injury or the bereavement. Presumably, in relation to all your members, they all stepped up and took a vaccine.
All of us did, yeah,
Yes.
including myself, and I actually volunteered at a vaccination centre in Kent, which was the first mass vaccination centre in Kent.
And sadly, your members suffered injury or bereavement thereafter, but don't know, and it's very difficult to find out, of course, whether or not that injury or bereavement was causatively connected to a vaccine, was the result of a vaccine, or coincidental, it just happened, or was connected to the COVID virus, because of course you could be infected with a vaccine, with a virus, and then have vaccination. But in some cases, your members have been able to demonstrate satisfactorily that there was a link.
Yes,
Is that a fair
in
summary?
around 50% of cases,
Right.
yes.
And the remainder, of course, are struggling to try to demonstrate the link,
Yes.
I presume.
Yeah, for the many reasons that we've outlined in our witness statement.
Yeah. And we'll come to those in brief in a moment. And do many of your members now suffer from chronic health conditions?
Yes, yeah, they do, or they're bereaved. So some of our members lost loved ones after COVID vaccination.
We were particularly struck by the fact in your statement, of which you speak, that some 52% of your members have between 10 and 25 symptoms. So the conditions, the chronic conditions which those who weren't bereaved suffer from, appears to be a multiple problem. It's a concatenation, a combination of medical conditions.
Yes, it seems to be like a relapsing, remitting phenotype, very similar to long COVID, but slightly different. And some of the acute conditions, when they turn chronic, such as neuropathy from Guillain-Barré syndrome, can affect different systems in different ways. So many symptoms can be had by one person with their condition.
Combination conditions.
Yeah.
And UKCV Family basically operates to provide support for such people. It signposts how they can get help. It seeks to raise awareness of their predicament, and it is, I think, the largest online support group for vaccine injured and bereaved in the United Kingdom.
Yes, and we've just actually received charitable status as well. So we're now a registered charity in England and Wales.
And how many members do you have?
Around 2,500 at the moment, with all the three support forum members combined.
And is that because the group at the heart of your organisation is the UKCV Family with around about 2,000 members, but there's a support group for family members, carers and friends, and there's also another group dealing specifically with the bereaved.
Yeah, we realised fairly early on that we needed to separate the three groups out because some of the people in the injured support group would like to talk about things that they might not want to divulge elsewhere. 76% of our group members surveyed said that they'd considered suicide, and it is a topic within the group. A lot of people are affected, their emotional health is affected by being vaccine injured.
And you say vaccine injured, of course, they may believe very strongly, but it is yet to be demonstrated in every individual case that the condition is vaccine caused.
Yeah, but there's normally a very heavy temporal link, and at least one person has suggested that it's vaccination, at least one medical professional has suggested it's vaccination.
And of course, you're aware that my lady, the chair, has granted your group core participant status, and you've contributed your experiences and your stories through the ESM process, and you are here today because of the obvious association with vaccines. Does your group hold a corporate view, if I may put it that way, on whether vaccines are good or bad, or is it concerned with the individual predicament of your members?
We try to remain neutral on the subject to whether vaccines are good or bad, because our members have very differing views, and if we're to support them all, we have to remain neutral on the wider subject of whether vaccines are generally a good or bad thing.
Yeah. And that's a very fair position to take. So in your voluminous statements, you have raised a huge number of points, topics and issues of concern described, and I simply cannot go through them all. A lot of them are, I'm afraid, out of scope. That's to say, they're just not within the remit of my lady's inquiry. But we're going to identify those areas that are within scope and in which you're inviting the inquiry to pay particular attention to. And as I read each one out, I'm going to give you an opportunity of trying to summarise what the main concern is that's held by your members, where a significant body of them, significant number of them, appear to you to to be concerned about this issue.
Yeah.
A very significant thread running through all 600 pages is the concern of your members about the effectiveness and safety of the vaccines. Is that general concern also tied in many places to the nature of the development and authorization processes that were in place? So you're concerned about how it worked in practice and whether or not the system was effective.
I think so, yes. I think obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, there were certain rules that were changed to accommodate the speed of the rollout of the vaccines and the manufacturing processes. And in the witness statement, we've gone into quite some detail about those different processes and how they may have been affected.
The clinical trial process, obviously, there is a very significant process by which any medicine has to be tried, clinically tried, pre-clinically tried, monitored and authorised. Do your members have concerns about the integrity and the efficacy of the overarching clinical trial process?
We do. We know of cases where clinical trial participants' data has been dropped when they've suffered an adverse reaction and not been included in the data.
All right, I'm going to stop you there. The same applies to you as to every other witness, including state or government witnesses. We can't be looking at individual cases, and it would be wrong to allow anybody to say, we know of cases where X and Y has happened. We don't know whether X and Y has happened. So I'm concerned to know from you, your concern with the clinical trial process, is it connected to worries about whether or not it was effective, whether it picked up side effects?
Yeah, I think we'd like to know what is an acceptable risk-benefit profile.
All right. Do you have concerns about diversity and whether or not population groups were sufficiently represented in the trials?
Yeah, for example, pregnant women weren't represented in the trials,
Yes.
yet the vaccines were recommended for pregnant women. Children, to start with, weren't in the trials. And obviously ethnic minorities, there wasn't many people in the trials from that group either.
Are you aware, so that you're aware of why we're focusing on this, that many of the trials were abroad where racial and ethnic makeup proportion ran, in fact, in the case of Pfizer, to 80%. So you're concerned, in fact, with diversity in the UK trials, I suspect?
Yes.
All right. Your members expressed concern about the size and scope of the phase 4 trials. Do you mean the trials that took place by way of the clinical provision of vaccines after authorization in the community? That's what the phase 4 trials are.
I would have to refer back to the witness statement to know exactly what as I said at the start of the witness statement, we actually had 6 of us write it. So that might not be a part that I paid a lot of detail to myself.
All right. You've mentioned acceptably safe. Understandably, your members would like to know more about how the vaccines were determined to be acceptably safe and what the MHRA in particular assessed was the correct risk-benefit balance.
Yes.
There are many references to that in your statement. You're concerned about the batch testing process, the way in which batches produced by manufacturers were tested, and you're concerned, or many of your members are concerned, about the whole operation of the MHRA's safety surveillance processes.
Yes, in particular the yellow card.
And on the yellow card scheme, Ms. Crichton, does your statement set out actually a lot of areas in which your members have expressed concerns about the scheme, from a lack of a mandatory obligation on doctors and public health clinicians to report side effects, the lack of public awareness of the scheme, how the data is accumulated, what the yellow card scheme says about causative links, whether the MHRA responded to yellow card reports by looking for clusters of symptoms. That's another big issue. how difficult it is for the scheme to be used, whether or not after reports are made in a yellow card and the MHRA has determined that they're of significance, the population should be told, or at least those persons who've reported side effects, of the MHRA's position. Is that a big issue? So feedback back to members of the public about side effects.
Yeah, our members have found that their yellow card reports were suddenly missing when they tried to follow them up. There were no actual follow-ups by the yellow card system to check on the people that had suffered an adverse reaction to see if they were recovering or not. Only 6% of people that are people in our group that actually reported, only 6% of those reports were made by medical professionals. So this shows that the public are reporting and not the medical professionals. But actually, as you know, the larger studies show that only around 10% of people know about the yellow card scheme and report. So this is massively underrepresented.
So there's a real issue about public awareness of the scheme and the ability to report, but also the degree to which people who report are followed up.
Yes.
So the MHRA may well look at NHS data, GP data, health data, but that doesn't necessarily mean to say that they're picking up the phone and speaking to or getting in touch with the person who made the report.
That's correct,
Right.
yeah.
Your members are concerned about the process by which vaccines were authorised for younger people. You're concerned about the state of public messaging, about the risks of adverse reactions, and as with a number of other similarly bereaved and injured groups, you want to know much more about how the MHRA responded to the emerging reports of the most serious conditions like TTS, myocarditis, pericarditis. You mentioned Guillain-Barré syndrome and ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis.
Yeah, and in particular, why the MHRA took such a long time in actually announcing the vaccine-induced thrombosis and thrombocytopenia situation to the public, especially as there was a letter sent by the Public Health England and the Royal Society of Haematology to hospitals 2 weeks prior. So the condition was known about, but the public weren't told.
Did you mean the information that was put into the public domain around about the Easter bank holiday weekend?
So this would be Easter, but there was a letter sent to hospitals from
Before the
Public Health
weekend.
England on the 22nd of March.
That's right.
Detailing how to manage it.
And you're concerned that either that the MHRA knew about the condition a long time before that letter went out, or that when the letter went out it wasn't enough, there should have been more data given and more information given at that same time.
Our concern is that we have members whose loved ones died in that period, and they feel that their loved one's death may have been prevented if the MHRA had been more public sooner.
Right. An important part of your statement deals with the vaccine damage payment scheme, which is the non-compensatory flat rate scheme. Many of your members, I expect, have made applications or tried to make applications under the scheme. Is that right?
That's correct.
And their concerns traverse almost every aspect of the scheme, don't they? From what must be established, the causative threshold, damage caused by a vaccine, prescribed vaccine, as well as the 60% severe disablement criteria, the amount of money which may be awarded, £120,000, as well as, many other aspects about how the scheme is managed, how long it takes, and whether or not actually it's fit for purpose.
That's correct, yes.
Right.
Many of our members have tried to claim the vaccine damage payment and been rejected. I think you can see from the numbers, Kate Scott read out last week, but there's been 17,500 claims and only 194 claims have been processed and awarded, and 416 people were not deemed disabled enough to meet the criteria. It isn't fulfilling a purpose, and it's very traumatic for someone when they're very ill, after they've done something that they were told to do, or they've lost a loved one, to fill out the form. The form asks, tell us what happened. And when I filled mine out, I was still very, very poorly in bed, and I filled it out laying down in bed on my bedside cabinet, and I literally put 3 sentences, and I just thought my medical records would speak enough. I thought I wouldn't have to tell the assessors what happened to me, because they'd look at my medical records and go, yep, adverse reaction, that's happened, she's unwell. That didn't happen. I was rejected, along with many other people. And as you know, you've heard in the Impact film, it has been extremely traumatic for some people, and in particular one family whose father died and took his own life. Because
And I've heard from the brother of the contributor who contacted me separately.
yeah. It's very, very traumatic for us, you know, and we've had suicides within the group, and we've attended funerals to these people.
I think in your statement, Ms. Crichton, appallingly, you refer to a survey which says that around about 76% of your members had considered suicide since they began to suffer from their conditions.
Yes, yeah, it's an extremely stigmatised illness. No one wants to hear that you've had an adverse reaction to the COVID vaccine.
2 final areas, please, which I'd like your help. There are many references in your statements to the systems by which members of the public are informed in advance of and after taking a vaccine of contraindications, side effects, benefits, and risks. The patient information leaflets. And there's also, as you know, the summary of product characteristics. And many of your members are concerned about the distribution and the use of the PILs, whether they properly knew the position. And VCOD is in there. The vaccine is a condition of deployment. What is your members' take on the merits or otherwise of the vaccine COVID deployment policy?
Yeah.
What's the take on that?
Some of our members were doctors, nurses, consultants, military personnel in public service, and they felt heavily pressurised to be vaccinated. When they did unfortunately suffer a vaccine injury, their injury wasn't classed as workplace injury, and subsequently they had their employment terminated.
We're talking here about your members who weren't in fact carers in a residential care.
We do have,
You've got some of those as well.
Yeah.
But for those people who weren't in that cohort, because the English government or the UK government in England only introduced VCOD for care home carers.
Nonetheless, there was still pressure on people.
Right. So they say they felt pressurised through their occupation.
Huge pressure.
To have a vaccine. Then they suffered, they say, harm or injury, and then haven't been able to be awarded payment under the VTPS.
Payment under the VDPS, and also no reasonable adjustments made at work, and being medically retired because of it. So, you know, we think that if you're going to make vaccines as a condition of deployment, then you need to make it a workplace injury, and also there needs to be better support emotionally, financially and medically for people that are suffering from adverse reactions before you actually mandate vaccines as a condition of deployment.
And may we be clear about this, probably the majority of your 2 statements speaks very eloquently about what you regard and your members regard as the absence of support. The lack of NHS treatment, the lack of financial and societal support in the terrible position in which they find themselves.
Yeah, I mean,
That's
the very fact that UKCV Family exists means that there was a gap in support.
Thank you very much. That's extremely helpful.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Credden. Again, terribly sorry about your loss, and I do hope you can now really focus on the grieving process. But thank you so much for coming along today.
Thank you.
My lady, that concludes the evidence for today.
Thank you all very much, and I shall sit again at 10 o'clock tomorrow.